Thank you for joining Sean Mixon, the Thought Decoder, on my YouTube channel, the Thought Decoder YouTube channel, where we teach you logic, we teach you how to state and to clearly defend your faith. And today we are joined by world-renowned Jesus scholar, Dr. Michael Licona. And Dr. Licona, just want to say thank you so much for joining with me on my channel today. It's very kind of you, and I'm excited about what I get a chance to learn today with you.
Well, thank you, Sean. It's good to join you today.
Yes. So for those who may not know you, what is it that you do? Do you have a elevator pitch, as it were, that you give people to kind of get them some type of clue as to what you do?
Well, I'm duly employed. I'm employed by Houston Baptist University, where I'm an associate professor of theology. I teach the philosophy of history there, and I teach a course called Scripture and Apologetics Implications. Both of those are graduate level courses, and I teach two undergraduate level courses. I teach the undergrad in the fall, the graduate in the spring. Love the university. What I really love about HBU is it's a broad evangelical tent.
Mm.
And we are, every year, we are consistently recognized as one of the most ethnically diverse
Mhm.
universities in the US. So
Wow.
that's pretty cool. We don't have all Christian students. Probably about 1/3 of our students are not believers. A lot
Mm.
of Muslims and Buddhists come from all over the world, especially because of our nursing program, which is one of the very best in the country. Um, I think we've got the best apologetics department in the country.
Mm.
It's just
Wow.
we got fantastic professors. Anyway, so I love the university. They can do everything. A student can do everything online, or they can do everything in person, or they can do it on a hybrid basis. I'm also employed by our nonprofit organization called Risen Jesus,
Mm.
for which I'm the president. And we have a couple different things we do. Three pillars we have. One is that I do research and writing.
Mm.
The other is second pillar is speaking and debating. And then the third is global reach, where we reach others through our social media platforms, especially our YouTube channels. So yeah, that's kind of, you could say, my elevator pitch. I
Awesome.
focus
Wow.
on matters such as the is, historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and also the reliability of the Gospels.
Okay, that's some great stuff, and I'll have the link to your channel in the bottom of the description. I'll
Well, thank you.
go back and add that. Uh, for those of you who are a part of the small apologetics world, those of you who have been at this for quite some time, as far as reading and learning from the leaders within the community, you would have known, and you probably already know who Dr. Lacona is. He's up there with Dr. William Lane Craig as far as his influence and his they've actually debated together. I believe they debated in Germany
South
once.
Africa. That
Oh,
was
that was South
fun.
Africa. Yeah,
That was
I
fun doing
actually
a
watched
two
that
on
debate.
two.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so
Mm.
Dr. Lacona has debated Shabir Ali masterfully in his debate with Dr. Ali. Although he debated him several times, but I believe maybe that was the last time you debated Dr. Ali. It was so masterful the way you undercut his argument from so-called inconsistencies within the gospels, because you went straight to Pauline writings, and you just kind of, well, okay, all right, but let's go to the even older writings where we have the gospel in First Corinthians. And I was like, and I had an aha moment. I said, oh, I see what he just did. You're avoiding all of the red herrings by going straight to the source. And now what can the inconsistencies or whatever, they don't matter anymore, because now you have to deal with with Paul, who was prior to Mark, you know, historically or chronologically. So
Yeah,
I mean,
Sean, you're right. The matter of gospel differences is a red herring when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, and it's fun just to eliminate that by saying, look, we got the writings of Paul, which predate the gospels. So, we can I can argue for the resurrection without even using the gospels. And as you know, I've written on gospel differences. I've studied
mhm,
this topic for years, so I don't
mhm.
shy away from the matter of gospel differences. But when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, it's irrelevant. To go down that is simply, as you've said, it's a red herring.
Right, and I have noticed that you've done several debates with Bart Ehrman, and on one particular debate with Dr. Ehrman, uh, on Unbelievable, he brought up the differences and within the Gospels, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the so-called inconsistencies, and again, he avoided uh, the historical bedrock. So I love your framework using abduction, uh, our argument to the best explanation. First step is you take the historical bedrock because that provides one with as much freedom from the accusation of bias, subjectivity, because this is like one of your criterions for objectivity was to submit yourself or expose yourself in a way to unsympathetic critics of your writings. And so with the historical bedrock, you already have historical facts or data, as it were, that a majority and a widespread group of scholars and different thinkers accept. But I did notice in your discussion with Dr. Ehrman, because before you can get to your hypothesis, if you first have to establish the facts. So Dr. Ehrman seemed to just, oh well, there aren't three facts. There's just one fact, and all you really have is just I people who claim to have had experiences. And I did notice that you were really being you were being very charitable and trying to word it into a way that he would accept, but he would just wiggle out every way he you would put it. He would try to wiggle out of the situation of accepting a fact, because once he accepts a fact, now he has to come up with a hypothesis to explain it,
Yeah,
right?
and
And now
what
he
makes it
gives
hard
himself to
for him
evaluation.
what makes it hard for Bart, who's become a friend of mine over the years. I like the guy. What makes it difficult for him is he grants the same facts that to which I was appealing.
Mm,
So, he can deny, uh, he can express displeasure over the way I arrive at those facts, but at the end of the day, he arrives at the same facts. So I could just say, look, I don't care if you don't like the reasons or the ways I get to the facts. If you don't, well, that's okay. What you get to you get to the same facts. So whatever your reasons for embracing those facts, let's just say they're my reasons. So
mm,
now we've got those facts. Now, what do we do with them? Let's focus
mhm,
on method and the conclusions.
mhm. And I did notice that Dr. Ehrman does something very he makes an interesting move. Uh Several times he would, I call it an objection from elitism. Maybe he's not trying to be elitist, but he makes claims like, oh, the historical community, there are no historians that accept the resurrection, right? So he'll make this point from apparent consensus that uh, there are tons of historians all over the world, and the percentage of those historians who accept the resurrection is so small. But when you point out that the historians who study these things, a large percentage of them accept them, then he says, ah, it's just because they're biased, right?
Right,
So
right.
it only works in one direction. And then Justin Beerley called him out. He said, "Well, he said, but don't you have just as much of a? Oh, of course, I yeah, of course, I have bias." So that was an interesting move to me. Sometimes he appeals to consensus when it fits his line of reasoning, but other times he rejects it and says, "Oh, consensus. Just because there's consensus, that doesn't mean that whatever you're defending is true."
Right. When the consensus goes against his views, then it doesn't matter, right?
Right, right. So I'm reading, going through your book, The Resurrection of Jesus, and I really find helpful the criteria that you lay out. Uh, even uh, even some of your in the earlier part, I call it an analysis of an eyewitness. You lay out some problems with certain eyewitness accounts, namely, the past is preserved in fragments. We have artifacts, and we have to look at past effects. That authors have their own agendas. Previous writers of history or ancient writers of history have their own agendas and their own cultural moldings. That many of them were only concerned with the times in which they lived, and they wrote present histories, and they weren't concerned about the past. Uh, that they have varying degrees of integrity, varying degrees of accuracy of their memories. That they rely on a cache of information that is also incomplete, and that it varies in its accuracy, and that historians are selective. They are selective in the events. They are selective in the data and in the narratives that they choose to uh, cover. And it's also difficult to determine intent. So I took all those areas of uh, concerns, historical concerns, and I began to think, wow, this is really like you can analyze a historical writer in terms of all of these different criteria. You can say, okay, well, what is his accuracy like? So you can look at his historical claims and try to find some things that are can be empirically tested or validated, and establish his accuracy in terms of the stories he tell. You can look at his integrity. Can we do we see him lying any in the text? So all those different uh, criteria you laid out there actually seems to provide a way of uh, a deeper way of studying, any writer of history.
Yeah, it certainly, shows that when it comes to historical investigation, there are a lot of things to take into consideration, and these are all challenges to our ability to know the past, at least with certainty. Now, it doesn't mean we cannot know the past. Postmodernist historians will say that and they vary to different degrees, of course, but a radical postmodernist historian would go so far as to say we can't know the past, that any reconstruction of the past is just simply a fictive narrative. It is historical fiction. It may not at all be true, and in a sense, there is a sense in which narratives are constructed, and they may or may not be true, or they may be true or false to different degrees. No one questions that, but a lot of postmodernists, the more radical ones, will take that to extreme to say that we can't know the past, that there really is no um, we're all working with grids. Okay, so
Mm,
say let's take the 9/11, the grid at which a jihadist Muslim will look at this. Like
mm,
when 9/11 happened, I remember the news showing some Muslims in, I think it was Pakistan, that when they showed the towers collapsing, there was cheers and
wow.
applause, as though a goal had been scored in a championship
Mm,
soccer game. And they're looking at it through a grid that would be like jihadist holy men of Allah, um, engaged in jihad, and um, did a righteous act against
mm,
thousands of infidels and scored a victory for Allah that day in Islam. Whereas an American might look at that and say, these evil terrorists killed thousands of innocent people in an unprovoked jihadist attack. Whereas
Mm,
someone in Israel might say, "Hey, join the club now. This is the kind of stuff we've been going on and facing for decades."
mm,
So, based on the grid, your grid is your horizon, your worldview, and everything that goes into it is going to be what helps you interpret an event. So it's
mm,
this interpretation that a postmodernist will say all we can get is an interpretation
mm.
of someone else's interpretation that's based on data that's no longer recoverable. So you can see where this can go into a
Right.
pessimism about knowing the past. But,
Mm,
you know, I think when it comes down to it, the world in which we live, you can be somewhat pessimistic and reserve, you know, you tone back the degree of certainty with which you talk about a conclusion. And I think that's fine. But you can apply this pessimism to so many things to the point where we
mhm.
can't even be certain that we exist,
Right.
rather than just being someone's dream or something like
Mm,
that.
mm,
So I'm a realist, a critical
mhm,
realist when it comes to historical investigation, not a postmodernist.
hmm. Okay. All right. So when you s- when we talk about when you talk about selectivity in your book, you say that writers can select events, they can select data, and even the interpretive details that they add to their memories in some sense is selective. Is that a part of the horizon? Because as far as our horizons are what establishes what's important to us, what gives us meaning, like you just said, how we interpret things, how we give meaning to things, and what we what we believe events mean. So does selectivity play a part? Is that included in the horizon, or how does that work?
It's not included in the horizon, but it's a result of the horizon.
Hmm.
So we all have these horizons, which it's our worldview, it's our experience, it's our biases, it's our desires that all forms what historians refer to as our horizon. It's like a pair of glasses that we put on, and those glasses have tinted lenses. So um, yeah, just to give you an example, a contemporary one here in the United States. So there's a lot of claims of racism. Just a couple of days ago, there was a kook who went in and just murdered a bunch of Asian women in massage parlors, right? Well, you start to hear claims of racism against Asian women, whereas that's not what was going on here. It's a matter of the guy is, you know, he's messed up. He was a pervert. He had lots of sexual problems and had
Hmm.
even been had inpatient treatment for it
Mm,
before. And he, by his own self-condemning testimony, he said that he murdered these women because of his sexual appetites that he was trying to suppress. Okay, so it's not racism, but it depends how you're looking at it. There's different people. And I got in a discussion with a dear brother yesterday about
mm,
this, and he was saying, no, it's racism. And I said, no, it's not. You don't.
mm,
So, we look at things differently because we have these different lenses. And, even a more, you know, Christians, we disagreed on whether it was right to vote for Trump, or should
mhm,
you keep back your vote for Trump and not vote for anyone or maybe a third party candidate. And then I have friends who are sincere believers. They love the Lord and they voted for Biden. And
mm,
it's our horizon. We look at things differently. We view the world differently, and certain so that's our horizon, and it results in how we interpret things and the kind of actions that often result from that.
mm. Okay. So continuing to move on, so in reading your book, I see that this notion of bias has a very central role in your thinking. not just your thinking, but you're thinking as a historian because they have this notion of horizon. But how did you define bias? Is there any rigorous definition of bias, or if the word if bias is itself just as contested, then how can we even talk about like bias if that word is, is
I
contested?
don't know that bias. I think we all know what bias is. You have, but your horizon includes your bias. It also includes your education. Um, so, I live in the Atlanta area. So, let's suppose I go to an Atlanta Braves game and there's a close play. A guy, it's a close play. A guy's coming home, and one of the Braves players coming home, trying to score, and the throw comes in from the outfield, and it's a really close play. I'm going to probably tend to, because of my bias, I want the Braves to win. I'm going to tend to think that the guy was safe. Whereas someone for the opposing team is going to be thinking, no, he was out by a mile. We're going to have these different biases. So let's apply it to the matter of Jesus's resurrection. I, as a Christian, was coming to this, and I had to admit, I came initially to the question of in my investigation of whether Jesus rose because I wanted to prove that he rose from a little different angle. I'm a
Mm,
Christian. I believed it was true already, and I had the objective of wanting to prove it from another angle. So I had bias, right? And then you'd have, say, an atheist, and let's say they're doing their investigation, they're going to have their own bias that, most of them are going to want to disprove the resurrection, and confirm their atheism. So all of us have biases. And look, when people who read my book on the resurrection, or who read Dale Allison's new book on the resurrection, or who read Bart Ehrman's book on the historical Jesus, they're going to pick it up, and they're going to pick it up from their own biases. A Christian would read my book more willing to accept the things I say in it, whereas an atheist might read my book with a very skeptical eye and be less inclined to accept the things I say in it. When we read a book written by someone with whom we agree, we're going to be more inclined to accept. Yeah, yeah, that's a great argument. And if they don't agree with us, we might be thinking, oh, that argument stinks. That's not strong. And
mhm,
our bias in a lot of cases is going to guide us through that. And so being able to manage that bias, to be able to say, look, I am biased, but it doesn't help me necessarily to be biased in if I'm investigating something like the resurrection of Jesus. What I need to do is to put my bias for a moment up on the shelf. All right, my desired outcomes. Let me put my desired outcomes up on the shelf, and then let me look at the facts openly and as neutral as possible, and let those facts speak as much as they can for themselves. Um, and realizing that we don't have to fear truth in something like this, as important as the resurrection.
mhm,
For me, my biggest fear is that my biases would prevent me from seeing truth, and it cost me eternity.
mm.
There are problems if
Pascal's
you,
wager.
yeah,
Mhm,
there are problems if you allow your bias. Well, at least if you're wrong and you allow your
right.
bias to get in there, um, it could cost you a lot. Now, if you're right, it may not cost you anything,
Mm,
but you may not know ahead of time. And if you're approaching
mhm,
this as a historian, you shouldn't come in it with your presuppositions if you're
mhm,
going to do an investigation with integrity.
mhm. So, Dr. Lacona, like yourself, my background is in philosophy, although you specialize in the philosophy of history. Uh, mhm. So, and I kind of wonder how much, because we can speak of people generally as having a bias, but I think that there may be some aspects of a person's individual personality traits that makes them more or less open to bias. I know myself, uh, I know myself, I've always been kind of like a I'm a philosopher now, but I've always been a philosopher. I would disagree with myself, right? I would argue with my in my mind. I'm just going back and forth, like, oh, this is oh, but that's really not good. It's like so I mean, and I've done this with everybody. I've read everyone I've heard. Like I've done this my entire life. So and sometimes it has become a problem. You know, I'm too open with people. I'm like, oh, this person is like, this is this type of person. Then I'm like, well, maybe he's not the type of person. Let me keep looking until he slaps me in the face. Oh, yeah, he's a violent person. You know, maybe I can be too open. So I wonder how much of bias is more related to personality type, which seems to be better described probably from through the social sciences, and it seems like that's like an intersection. But just listening to the how you describe bias, it's you have you have a certain vested interest because of your past or your a set of beliefs to accept some other proposition because maybe your the set of your beliefs is in whole entails that proposition in the sense that it's already a part of your beliefs, right? So you have a vested interest in believing it because it's already something you believe. Or uh you quote McCullough, the historian McCullough, as saying that others have had bias that shows itself by a tendency not to have or consider alternative hypotheses. I think in terms of bias that's something more that I can grasp because otherwise it seems like bias is something just that kind of like the coronavirus. It kind of infects you and you don't know when you have it. And is it a malady? Is it a belief? Is it a desire? Is bias a certain or is it a disposition towards truth? Because and you kind of suggest that it's not because you admit that people can be have a bias towards something and that bias make them more likely to discover evidence you write in your book than if they didn't. And then it can be you said it can be advantageous or disadvantageous.
Sure. And I think in the book, I mean, I wrote it over 10 years ago, so I'm not, but I think in there, I'd say that, you know, bias can help you some. Like, for example, in the case of, let's say you're an African American historian
Hmm.
doing work on slavery in the US.
Hmm.
You might be willing to dig deeper into a story to
Mm,
find truth than, say, a Caucasian historian would,
mm.
because you know you have a horse in the race,
Right, right.
or a Jewish historian who's studying the Holocaust
Hmm.
on maybe, let's say, an event that is uncertain what's behind it. The Jewish historian studying, say, an atrocity in Nazi Germany during the Second World War might be willing to go a lot deeper into it and look at things more critically and more in depth than, say, a Gentile
Hmm.
historian because they've got a horse in the race.
Hmm.
So, yeah, sometimes bias can certainly assist you.
Okay. And so with that being said, it seems to me that the worry about with bias is not that it's a bias, but what motivates the bias. For example, if I am biased, if we define bias like a person is biased towards a belief P if they just want P to be true, right? So well, you can examine it. Well, okay, yeah, that person is biased. But what if they also have this desire, another desire, they want to believe what's true? And they believe that P is true. Therefore, they're biased towards P because they want to believe what's true, and they think that P is true. So bias there, it seems like the true worry about bias is one's openness towards contrary evidence or towards an argument that goes against that belief. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay. And so moving along, what so what how do you conceive of objectivity? Because the criteria you lay out is so that we can be more objective. You do say that you can't be no one can be completely objective, but what is objectivity in those terms?
Well, objectivity, I would think, would be looking at the data and trying as best as possible to formulate uh, different hypotheses and determine which one actually is a truthful description of what
Mm,
occurred. I think,
mm,
if you're seeking after the truth, I think that's the objectivity we're looking for.
okay.
Subjectivity would, be more or less, I've got my own desires here, and
Mm,
how can I back up those desires?
mm, mhm. Okay. All right. Good deal. So you you move into in your book, you move into how you give some criteria to evaluate hypotheses, but I want to take a step back because you do start with the historical bedrock. So how does one establish historical bedrock?
Well, I think Gary Habermas has a good way of doing it. He calls it the minimal facts.
Mm,
And he's kept that term over the years because, I mean, that's what he started with. And it wasn't initially historical bedrock to which he was referring. He started
mm,
off by saying, all right, here are 12 facts about the that applied to the resurrection, for which a majority of scholars agree on these. And then when he came up with the minimal facts approach, he said, you know what? I could take any five of these facts. You can choose any five. And we can build a strong case for the resurrection of Jesus based on these minimal number of facts. And that's what
mm,
the original minimal facts argument was.
mm,
But now you could say there's minimal facts 2.0. It's kind of morphed
mm,
over time with Gary. And so minimal facts would be those facts that meet two criteria. Number one, the data supporting them are very strong. And number two, the majority of critical scholars grant them as facts. So
okay.
that doesn't mean, this is not arguing from authority that they're facts because the majority of critical scholars grant them. No, it's these two things. So, it, number one, the data supporting the facts are very strong. That's the most important. But number two, they are so
Mm,
strong that they've even persuaded the majority of critical scholars studying the subject, including
mm,
skeptics. And I think that goes to the bias thing. So if you've got critical scholars who are looking at this, now a lot of them are going to be Christians. A lot of them are not going to be Christians, at
mhm.
least in the sense that, I mean, they may call themselves Christians, but they'll deny God's exist. I mean, I know a couple of them like that. I know two of them like this. They've told me, they don't believe God
Wow.
exists in the way that we would imagine a personal creator being. They
Yeah.
reject that view, and they're not even certain there's an afterlife, but yet
Mm,
they'll call themselves Christians,
mm,
Christian scholars. So there are a number of New Testament scholars like that, and so I guess what I'd say is you've got a number of scholars, critical scholars, who are saying, yep, these things can be regarded as facts because the
mm.
data supporting it is so strong. So that's the minimal facts argument. We'd say the same thing about historical bedrock. Historical bedrock, as Paula Fredrickson had said, it's facts past doubting.
Mm.
So that's what we want to look at. And a
Wow.
hypothesis needs to account for those. If it can't, then something's wrong with the hypothesis.
Hmm. Okay. So it's in terms of the first criteria, you said supporting evidence. Would those supporting evidence be things like text, artifacts, and past effects that you kind of mentioned in your first chapter?
Would you repeat that, Sean?
So as far as supporting evidence, what types of things
Oh,
would be supporting evidence?
well, I guess it depends what we're looking at. So let's just talk about Jesus's death by crucifixion. Is that a fact? Is it a fact, a historical fact, that Jesus died by crucifixion. What's the supporting evidence? Well, we have multiple independent sources. We have some early sources. We have some sources which very well may be eyewitness sources, or at least are closely rooted in the eyewitnesses. We have embarrassing kind of testimony. So you have Jesus on the cross saying, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Whereas in a lot of Jewish and even Christian martyrdom accounts, you have Christians, or the Jews and some of the Christians saying, "God, I have not forsaken your law," just before they die this torturous, brutal death. Um, and they're trash talking their torturers. Whereas
Wow.
Jesus is like, he wants out if possible. "Father, if it's your will, let this cup pass from
Mm.
me." And he gets on the cross. "Why have you forsaken me?" This would have been somewhat embarrassing to the early Christians when compared to, say, the Jewish martyrdom literature of that time, of that era. You've got
Do you have a list of those criteria in your book? Like the
um,
multiple attestation,
well, I don't know that
embarrassment?
I don't know that I take time to say, okay, here are certain criteria, and then I list
Mhm,
them, the criteria of authenticity.
mhm.
But what I do is when I'm talking about different facts, I think it's chapter
You use them.
3, the
Okay.
historical bedrock. I go over some of those criteria. So, like for
Mm,
Jesus' death by crucifixion, I will explain that the criterion of embarrassment, the criterion of multiple independent sources, of early sources, of unsympathetic sources. So when you have Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, and Amar, Bar Serapion all mentioning Jesus's execution by the Romans, that's those are 4 unsympathetic sources. Even someone like Lucian and Tacitus are even hostile toward the Christian faith. So, these are all things that weigh in favor of the historicity, or the report being an authentic recollection,
okay.
or a true
So
recollection. Yeah.
so what would you say to this, question came in, what would you say to this claim that there are no extra biblical sources contemporary to the life and times of Jesus Christ, uh, even to deduce the accuracy of the scriptures,
It was
maybe
the
the
last thing,
gospels.
even to what? Or that
There are
corroborate
no
what the scriptures are saying?
so but I think he has in mind reliability. There are no contemporary extra biblical sources uh to the life and times of Jesus Christ
That mention him.
to right to demonstrate the reliability
Well,
of the
it
scriptures
is
or the
true that there
accuracy.
are no sources that were written during the life of Jesus that mention him. Okay? That's true. That doesn't mean he never existed. It doesn't do away with the reliability of the accounts. The same could be said with a lot of ancient history. So, um, the thing is the evidence we have sufficient to establish these things? And when you have multiple independent sources, early sources, unsympathetic sources, when even non-Christian sources are mentioning some of these things, even non-Christian sources that are hostile to the Christian faith, why are you wanting to deny something like Jesus's death by crucifixion, and,
Mm,
and saying we don't have sufficient sources because they weren't written while Jesus was still alive? That
mm,
sounds to me like you're being motivated more by by your own
mm,
bias than by trying to get to actual historical truth.
because if I deny it, kind of like the Erman move, if I deny the fact, then I don't have to explain it.
Yeah, I mean,
So if he wasn't crucified,
there's a number of things that um, I mean, like for example, Alexander the Great. Some of our earliest source, I think, is what's it, Arian, first
mhm,
century, and then you've got Plutarch, early second century.
mm,
Well, Alexander died in the late fourth century. Um,
mm,
so, are you going to reject about Alexander because We don't have real early credible sources about him? Well, of course not. Are you going to reject Caesar's crossing the Rubicon because we don't have any eyewitness who mentions it? Not even Caesar himself mentions it in his commentary on the Civil War that he crossed the Rubicon. He doesn't mention it. Um, and a lot of the sources we have are later. So yeah, I think that's just
Arguments from silence.
huh?
Arguments from silence,
I mean,
basically.
we've got good evidence that Caesar
Hmm.
crossed the Rubicon. Caesar doesn't mention it, but he does so. I guess you could say in an indirect manner.
Mm.
But you do have people who, because he mentions himself being in Ravenna, and then he mentions himself being in Ariminum. You have to cross the Rubicon to get there, but he doesn't mention the Rubicon crossing himself.
Mm.
Anyway, there's a lot that could be said in this way. No, we don't have any contemporary accounts or accounts written of Jesus while Jesus was still alive. But that's by no means a defeater, not even
Right.
close.
The question is like, okay, and
Yeah,
what
and
follows? What follows from that? I think that's it's kind of like a strange. If something sounds like an objection, then it feels like an objection. You know what I mean? And then it's like, oh, well, people keep saying this, but then if you once you think about it, it's like, okay, well, what's the point? What's the conclusion supposed to be for that? So in terms of two questions, how would you define an independent source? And then what would you consider good evidence? Although you kind of laid that out, maybe good evidence for historical authenticity, or maybe you can repeat some of those criteria you just said. And then how do you define independent sources? Because it seems as if this objection kind of assumes that the gospels aren't independent sources, right? They're in my Bible, they're put together in my Bible, therefore it's one thing. The Bible is one book, so this is not an independent, source kind of approach.
well, independent sources. This is an interesting topic, actually. So, Sean, let's say that you and I are at an event. We go to a conference together, and we hear Gary Habermas speak. Okay, and then at dinner, we're with someone who did not attend that lecture by Gary, and we're both telling that person about Gary's lecture. Well, we are multiple independent sources because
Mm,
we were there, right? We were both
mm,
there. Now,
mm,
if if I hear Gary speak and then I tell you what he said, and then you tell someone else, and you said, "Hey, I heard from Mike Licona what Gary said at that at his thing." Well, it's not Mike and you are not independent sources. It's one source, right? It's me.
mm.
It's not me and Gary,
Ah,
Gary and me. That's just me is the source.
mm,
So when it comes to the Gospels, most scholars agree that Matthew and Luke use Mark significantly and they supplement Mark. Now, when they're using Mark, they're not an independent source.
mm,
Okay. But
mhm,
that gets a little thorny,
mm,
gets a little muddy because let's say that Matthew was let's say that Matthew was really behind the Gospel of Matthew, which is questioned today, highly questionable by a lot of scholars. Most New Testament scholars don't think that Matthew wrote the Gospel. I don't think that he composed it himself. I think he used the secretary to do it.
mm,
I think all of them probably used secretaries, perhaps even Luke, even though he's the
mhm,
most educated. But I think certainly Matthew and John, and I tend to go with the traditional authorship of John. But I think that they used secretaries to compose their gospels. Paul and Cicero, some of very highly educated people, they used secretaries to help them compose letters. So Cicero had a secretary named Tiro with
mm,
whom he relied heavily on. And then you've got Paul, who said he used secretaries. And in fact, in Romans 16:22, it says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter,
Wow.
greet you in the Lord. And because Romans is Paul's crown jewel, the way he writes it is far superior to most of his other letters. I think we can assume that Tertius played a big part in the composition of of, um, of Romans. But again, Cicero used Hero as a major player in
Mm,
helping him compose his letters and his writings. So if that's the case, and you have educated people like that, well, of course you're going to have a tax collector and a fisherman use secretaries to help them compose gospels, which are longer than letters.
mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I've even noticed in John, I was reading, I believe John 12. It may be John 12. But it says that there were some Greeks who wanted to meet Jesus. And they came up to me and I'm saying, wow, this is crazy. So you have in the gospels Jesus encountering some Greeks, and most likely they probably were Greek Jews. I mean, they're in Israel, and then they want to meet Jesus, and why would they even care about his teachings
I'm not
otherwise?
sure where you're getting at with that. Are you thinking because
Yeah,
Jesus would have spoken primarily in Aramaic, or his disciples would?
well, I was fascinated. I was interested in the fact that the Gospels are written in Greek,
Oh, okay.
and you
Yeah,
have
well,
some internal
certainly
evidence.
Jesus, it's fairly certain that Jesus' primary language was Aramaic, and he probably
Hmm.
spoke most of the time in Aramaic. But back then, you had a lot of bilinguals,
Mm,
and I would suspect that Jesus was fairly fluent in Greek, as were his
wow,
disciples. And so I
wow.
don't think it wouldn't have been the primary language, but certainly when I don't think we don't have to imagine that Jesus had an interpreter every time a non-Jew came up to him,
Mm,
or that the non-Jews, the Gentiles, were required to speak in Aramaic. I think they probably conversed with one another in Greek. I think Pilate and Jesus probably conversed in Greek. I love the movie The Passion of the Christ. It's my favorite of all movies. But I think
mm,
that Gibson got it wrong when he had Jesus speaking in Aramaic and Pilate speaking in Latin. I think they were
mm.
probably speaking to one another in Greek. So
Wow.
Greek was the lingua franca. It was the major
Okay.
language of that day, and so the Gospels are written in that language.
Hmm. Well, that makes sense.
And I
Uh,
think it's likely that that's all the more reason to think that um, you know John and Matthew are written in good Greek. Matthew really does he might have the most artistic of all the Gospels in the way he
really?
does things. So I would suspect that we definitely have secretaries involved to help them compose these gospels.
Okay. And so has anyone done any work on that, like what you just said, or is
Oh
that a
yeah, oh yeah, plenty. In terms of secretaries, you may want to look at a great book by Randy Richards. I think it's called Paul and the Secretaries of His Letters or something like that. E.
okay?
Randolph Richards, really a groundbreaking book. It was his doctoral dissertation that was later expanded. So don't buy his doctoral dissertation. I did that. It was like 60 some dollars and I read it. And then he said, oh, by the way, Mike, years later, I expanded that and I got it. And so you can buy that book for like $13. It's like, oh man, so, and it's got more to it. So he's the expert on that. He's got some really good stuff.
Okay. And as far as the Greek being the lingua franca of of, of Jerusalem, or just Israel at Palestine at that time, uh, what evidence do you have for that, or what supported
You
that?
know, this is that's one of those things that is not even disputed.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, that's
So
a
that's
given.
historical bedrock.
Oh yeah, I mean nobody's really going to disagree with that. But
Wow.
you've got a lot of literature that's written in the Koine Greek, and some in Attic Greek. So, but the Greek of that day, you've got you even go to Jerusalem. They have discovered a synagogue in Jerusalem that has the um, a welcome, and it's written in Greek. You've got some
Mm.
of the ossuaries, the bone boxes, and they have a
Oh,
lot
that's good.
of Greek on them. So, oh, you have that the plaque that was put on Jesus' cross, and it's written in Latin, in Hebrew, and in Greek, which would seem to suggest that they anticipated that at Passover there would be people from all over that
Who
spoke
could
and
read it?
read all of those languages, not just
Wow.
Aramaic, but also Latin and Greek.
Wow, that's some good stuff. I hadn't heard that from you. uh, so I guess now what are the facts of the resurrection? Uh, that that what's your case for the resurrection as terms of the facts that need to be explained? And then Dr. Ehrman debated Dr. Craig as well, and he in that debate he said, what if one of the disciples had a twin, and the twin, it was Jesus's twin who actually died, and no one knew that he had this twin, and that's what happened. So when he finally gives, I was like, when he finally gives a competing hypothesis, this is what he comes. So he just denied the facts. Uh, so what would be those facts that need to be explained?
Well, first, let me say this, since you mentioned the twin hypothesis, is that the beauty of approaching the resurrection as a historian is that when we use historical method, you don't have to prove a hypothesis or establish the truth of a hypothesis beyond all doubt, or be able
Mm.
to answer every last possible objection.
Huh.
It's the hypothesis that explains the data, the historical bedrock, better than other hypotheses.
Mhm.
So whatever hypothesis can do that, even if it's not perfect, it's
Mhm.
that hypothesis that is considered to be the accurate historical description. So you could say, well, what if, and I could even in some cases say, yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. But if my hypothesis still explains the data better than yours, my hypothesis wins.
Hmm.
Okay.
Do you have any
So
examples of historians actually having a set of data and coming up with a hypothesis that best explained it?
sure, that's what they do all the time, right? Because none of us can get into a time machine and go back to the past and verify our
Mhm.
conclusions. What we are looking for is we take the facts, we formulate hypotheses, and we try to weigh those hypotheses to see which one best explains the facts. Now,
Mhm.
let's just take something like the um, the twin hypothesis. Okay. So now you got to look at it and you say, all right, Jesus had an identical twin, which, by the way, that was posited by a guy named Greg Cavan, an atheist philosophy professor out in California. And he
Hmm.
did his doctoral dissertation years ago. I'm guessing it's probably in the 1980s, 1990s. I debated him out in Temecula, California, several years ago, and that debate is on my YouTube channel. But he said in his doctoral dissertation, when you look at all the naturalistic explanations out there, none of them really do a good job. So there's only really one that's even possible, and that is that Jesus had an identical twin. And he said that that would be the best explanation for what occurred. But before our debate, he said, "Look," he said, "he doesn't." He asked me not to bring that up because he doesn't
Mm.
embrace it.
Oh
So even
wow.
the guy that came up with it doesn't embrace it. But you got to look at how
Wow.
it, okay, well, how does that account for the historical bedrock of, say, Jesus' disciples had experiences that they perceived as appearances of the risen Jesus to them shortly after their death? Well, maybe was that an identical twin? Well,
Mm.
where did he come from? Was he a disciple beforehand? Well, he couldn't have been, because if he was, then they're saying, okay, this is Jesus. Where's his identical twin brother? Why
Mm.
did he just disappear? Wouldn't they think that that's exactly what
Right.
was going on? Moreover, when you do talk to people who are identical twins, and I've probably done this with several dozen of them over the years,
Oh wow.
virtually every one of them, virtually everyone will tell you, they told me that they can't fool their parents or their other siblings, or their closest friends or their spouses.
Hmm.
Because with identical twins, you and I might not be able to tell them apart if we don't really know
Mm-hmm.
them. But if we
Mm-hmm.
know them well, we've come to understand the differences in their voices, the differences
Mm-hmm.
in facial expressions, body
Mm-hmm.
language, things like that. You can tell the difference. And most of them will say that they can fool their friends, maybe even their spouse at times, until they start talking. And then they just know it's the other one. You can't pull a trick on, on people who really know them well. Well, these disciples had traveled with Jesus for at least a year and a half. There's no way they're going to be able to do it. And then you got to ask, well, why is it that this identical twin, which would have had to have been hidden from them for years, all of a sudden sees his identical twin brother, Jesus, if he even knew he was an identical twin of him, sees him brutally scourged and crucified? Who would in the right mind would want to come in and say, hey, guess what, it's me again and I'm back? Why wouldn't the Romans say, all right, pal, let's try this again, buddy,
Mm.
and we're gonna make sure you don't come back this time.
Yeah, that's a great
So
point.
it's just not the plausibility in it. It's ad hoc.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't explain all of the facts. It seems like you're forcing some things to fit. It's just not plausible. It doesn't really do a good job with the criteria of inference to the best explanation, whereas the
Mm-hmm.
resurrection hypothesis does a really good job with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I did read one thing in your book where you said sometimes there may be an apparent difficulty in transcending your horizon. And I was thinking about that. I think Dr. Craig has a great approach at that because he demonstrates through philosophical argument that the existence of God either is the best explanation for observed effects in the universe, or that if you look at it deductively, that God has to exist. So therefore, now you have God, and it greatly increases the probability. He compares, like when he debated Bart Ehrman, Dr. Ehrman, he said, well, the probability of that Jesus rose naturally from the dead, that's fantastic. But he said, but the probability that God raised Jesus from the dead, given that God exists, that probability is very high. And so it's almost like, well, you make an establish a rational warrant for some of those horizons and use the horizon in your historical work. And it raises another funny point. It's funny to me. It tickles me that Dr. Ehrman says, "Oh, well, you're not doing history at this point, right? You're not doing history." But when you asked him about miracles, he brings up, well, the problem of evil. God must not exist. Oh, well, you're not doing history.
That's right.
It's the same thing. Oh, now you're not doing history. You're saying God doesn't exist, therefore he can't create miracles. And I think, and I, Dr. Craig made an interesting point. He said, well, if the historian cannot make any judgments about that include God, then you can't say that it was or was not a miracle. You can't even say whether Jesus rose. You have nothing to say about the probability at all. I
That's
said, wow,
correct.
that's great.
That's
That was another
correct.
great point.
Bill's correct there. I do think, now I like to distinguish between, when I do things historically, I like to distinguish between what is verifiably historical and what is a theological element. So when we say the statement, Jesus died for our sins, the historian can work with the historical element of that, the death of Jesus. They can verify that Jesus died by crucifixion. But the historian does not have any tools to say that Jesus' death atones for our sins.
Mm,
The
hmm.
historian could say that the early Christians believed Jesus' death atones for our sins, but what possible tool could the historian have that would be able to verify that
Hmm.
his death actually atones for our sins? In the
Yeah.
same way, if you're going to say the statement, God raised Jesus from the dead, I think the historian does have the tools to be able to verify whether Jesus was actually raised from the dead, whether he came back to life after his execution. But the historian doesn't have any tools to verify that God did it. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily a problem for, verifying whether Jesus rose from the dead. An illustration that I like to give is if you have, if you had a bunch of astronomers who were able to discover that there was a comet that was going to crash into the moon on a certain day and at a certain time on that day. Let's say that you got the Hubble Space Telescope and a number of other planetariums from all over the world. They are zeroed in on the moon on that day and time when the comet is supposed to crash into the moon. And sure enough, they see it. Bam! It happens. And as the lunar dust settles, there is a message written on the moon's surface that says, Jesus is Lord, and it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, an astronomer may not, an astronomer would say, we have no idea how that message got on the moon's surface. We don't know how the comet could have done that. We have no way to be able to do it. When someone says to him, well, did God did it? The scientist would have to say, well, I don't have any tools to be able to determine whether God did it one way or the other. I mean, you would think maybe he did it, but I, as a scientist, can't affirm that. I mean, I don't have any tools for it. But you wouldn't turn around, that scientists wouldn't turn around and say, well, it's also, therefore, it's inconclusive whether the comet crashed in the moon's surface and left the statement, Jesus is Lord. You can, as a scientist, the scientist has the tools to determine that the event occurred, but does not have the tools to determine the cause of the event. And I think the same thing happens with the resurrection of Jesus. And this was where Ehrman and some others get things wrong. They want to say, because if you say God raised, or if you say Jesus rose from the dead, that would require God. And now you're no longer doing history. No, wait a minute. You're the one that put God into the equation, not me at this point. I am the one doing history. My investigation is limited to answering the question of whether Jesus was raised from the dead. It cannot include anything pertaining to the cause of the resurrection. Now, by implication, you might look at and say, what's the cause? And I think the historian might be justified in positing a theoretical entity such as God, but the historian doesn't have any tools to be able to verify that it was God.
Okay. So that's almost like an empirical method that limits you to, and I don't want to say methodological naturalism.
Well, you could almost say you could almost say, Sean, that it is a methodological naturalism, but I think it's a much more reasonable one and unbiased one than the methodological naturalism that's typically out there. The methodological naturalism would be something that's typically out there is something like what Ehrman and many others, even some Christian scholars, embrace, to say, okay, well, we can't say whether historians can't say whether Jesus rose because it would involve God, and therefore it would be a miracle, and historians don't have the tools for that. But as I explained, the historian could, in principle, conclude that Jesus rose and deal with that without dealing with the cause. Scientists do this kind of stuff all the time. Why not historians?
Good point. And on that note, we're gonna end today's interview. It's been a wonderful pleasure. Thank you guys for tuning in. And I know you would like us to invite Dr. Licona back, and if he could come back, we would be very much appreciative. But Dr. Licona, we thank you for this, and I'll end the live chat right now.